Our next speaker is Ken Horrigan, I beg your pardon. Ken is the manager of the Heritage Branch in the Department of Environment and Resource Management here in Queensland. He is the principal policy person for heritage in this state, and in 2009 he was fortunate to be awarded a Churchill Fellowship to study international approaches to the relationship between heritage conservation and sustainability. And I'll very quickly hand over to Ken.
Well, thank you, everybody. As David mentioned, in 2009 I was fortunate to be awarded a Churchill Fellowship to study, in basic terms, the relationship between heritage conservation and sustainability. Churchill Fellowships are awarded for Australians to travel overseas to undertake research and training projects. And I was fortunate in that I was supported by my employer, the Department of Environment and Resource Management, to undertake this fellowship. Now, the main aims of my fellowship were to investigate the current thinking and policy positions of key government and non-government organisations with regard to the relationship between heritage conservation and sustainability, and the results from a number of projects that I'd been looking at, which were focusing on energy efficiency and heritage buildings. And I was also interested in how leading environmental rating tools and systems currently address heritage buildings and how these systems are evolving. There are many organisations and individuals which are working on issues pertaining to sustainability and sustainable development, but I chose to visit the following organisations because of their focus on heritage conservation. And my research indicated that English Heritage is currently providing leadership in understanding and undertaking research into the environmental performance of heritage buildings and the impacts of climate change on the historic environment. And there's also a growing body of knowledge in the USA and Canada. My fellowship was undertaken between late September and early November 2009. And as I mentioned, I visited a range of organisations, government and non-government. And the timing of the fellowship was really dictated by two conferences that I attended. The first one was Heritage Canada Conference, which was specifically in relation to heritage buildings and sustainability, and that was in Toronto. And then the APT conference in Los Angeles. The particular reason I wanted to attend that was the APT has a technical subcommittee on sustainable preservation, and they're having a meeting at that conference, which I got to participate at and have since joined that subcommittee. And they'll be holding a major summit in Canada next year. So for those of you who like to see where exactly I went and who I visited, my first stop was Canada, and I went to Victoria in British Columbia. And Victoria, for those of you who don't know, is on Vancouver Island over here. I visited the provincial government agency and as well as the local government agency and the Heritage Trust to see the range of policy responses that were being developed in Canada. British Columbia is one of the more progressive provinces in relation to this area. In Toronto, I attended the conference, and then I visited Ottawa, the capital, and met with the Public Works Government Services Canada and the National Historic Sites Directorate, which includes Parks Canada. In the UK, I was basically based in two places, one being Swindon, and Swindon is about an hour or so out of London, near Reading. Swindon is the headquarters of English Heritage and the National Trust. I also visited, I spent a week with Historic Scotland and was based in Edinburgh, and visited a range of organisations there that they've undertaken partnership projects with. And then I returned to Swindon for some further work. And then in the USA, my first stop was Springfield, Illinois, home of Abraham Lincoln, which is midway here, south of Chicago. I really visited Springfield because of Mike Jackson, who's an expert in this area, and I wanted to meet with him. Then I went across to Boston, met with Jean Caroon from Goody Clancy Architects. She was writing a book which has just been published, Sustainable Preservation, Greening Existing Buildings, if anybody's interested. I then visited Washington, D.C. To the National Park Service and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and concluded my fellowship in Los Angeles at the APT conference. My interest in this area really developed a few years ago when I was managing the preparation of the Queensland Heritage Strategy, a 10-year plan, which was launched by the Honourable Kate Jones, Minister for Climate Change and Sustainability, in October 2009. The strategy was developed in close consultation and with the support of the Queensland Heritage Council. It is Queensland's first heritage strategy and provides a heritage policy framework for the next 10 years. It includes a number of priorities and actions relating to heritage conservation as a key component of sustainability, and it identifies energy efficiency and environmental performance of heritage buildings as a key strategic area for action. My research had indicated that the sustainable design movement had begun to codify a formal approach to establishing and evaluating what makes a building green. There are many methods that attempt to measure the environmental performance of a building, and some of the major tools in the countries I visited, well, we have our own Green Star rating system here in Australia. The BRE environmental assessment method is prominent in the UK, and LEED, which is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, is prominent in the US. But concerns have been expressed that these standardised tools are lacking in how they address heritage buildings. Specifically, the standards do not account for the retention of historic material and its cultural value. They do not effectively consider the performance, longer service lives and embodied energy of historic materials, and are overly focused on the current or future technologies, neglecting how past experience helps to determine sustainable environmental performance. So that was the basis for my interest in the area and applying for and being awarded the Churchill Fellowship. My findings after visiting the UK, Canada and the US was basically that in the United Kingdom, the UK is subject to a directive of the European Parliament and of the Council, which requires member states to apply minimum requirements regarding the energy performance of new and existing buildings. And the UK is really responding to this directive by tightening regulations. The UK is also reforming aspects of its planning system and to address sustainability and heritage conservation. And there's a strong research focus, particularly on the performance of building materials and building elements. However, there was a lack of reliable data about the performance of historic buildings, and most of the assessments of energy use were based on theoretical models. And this was a particular concern to English Heritage. It was concerned about the level of assumptions being made, particularly about U value, which is thermal transmittance, about the heat transfer through a material, which we used in calculations. And it's responded to the need to gather this data by undertaking extensive research projects. One project I was particularly interested in was that currently their regulations are really focused on reducing heat loss from a building, and a lot of that interest is in relation to windows. So they've undertaken a project with Historic Scotland and Glasgow Caledonian University to measure the environmental thermal performance of traditional windows. And it was quite interesting. It revealed that if they're properly maintained, properly repaired, they can satisfy the current building regulation targets, and with the addition of shutters, blinds or curtains, as you would normally have in those climates, further improvements to thermal performance can be made. And that was quite interesting because there's a lot of assumptions about the problem with heat loss, and you need to replace the windows as a result of that. And they've kind of shown that there are other ways of achieving that, more simple ways of dealing with drafts and insulation in roof spaces, etc. Another particular project I was interested before I went there, when I'd read about it, was a project called Hearth and Home, which planned to monitor the energy usage of 20 terrace houses to evaluate the cost effectiveness of energy saving options and to provide guidance on measures to reduce domestic fuel use. I was reading about this pre our involvement in the projects that Jim mentioned, so I was quite interested in how English Heritage was attacking this problem. However, by the time I went on my Churchill Fellowship, we're in the midst of the global financial crisis, and every organisation I visited basically had suffered some form of funding cut, and funding was being cut or taken away from particular projects. So this project I've recently discovered hasn't really progressed, and it's been recast as a broader program of research, practical advice and policy development. And I was interested in that, in the sense that prior to me going on my Churchill Fellowship, there had been sort of a growing, increasing amount of discussion in the UK in particular about the need for the demolition of traditional housing stock because of its poor performance and its replacement with more efficient housing stock. Of course, that was of great concern to heritage advocates, and of course it generated interest in trying to understand how the buildings actually perform and what measures can be taken. Now, with the onset of the GFC and obviously the financial status, financial conditions changing, a lot of that pressure seems to have abated, but it's not to say it won't arise again. There was a study by the Oxford Environmental Change Institute in 2007 which was recommending increased demolition of traditional housing stock. English Heritage, Historic Scotland and other jurisdictions are undertaking demonstration projects, and they produce a great amount of guidance material. And the National Trust really has a very strong educative role and leads by example with relation to the management of its properties. Another project which I was interested in at the time was a pilot study in Soho, which was looking at the sustainability of core areas. And so it was taking rather than a place-based approach, but a precinct approach. And it really found that an integrated approach to retrofitting is essential, and that the greatest benefits are to be achieved by scaling up to community-wide solutions such as district combined heat and power network. And I was interested to see there'll be a second stage of that project, and interested to see if it has any ramifications for us, particularly inner city areas, historic inner city areas.